All right, let's jump right in. We're going to tackle a huge and super timely question today. What exactly is the populist paradox? And, is it a threat to democracy?
So here's the central puzzle, right? If populism is supposed to be all about championing the people, why does it seem to be in a constant battle with democracy? I mean, it's a real paradox, because when you look at it, they both claim to be about the same thing: government by the people.
And that's what's so wild. Both of them are supposedly built on the very same foundation. But the relationship is incredibly complex. So let's dig in and see if we can unpack this thing together.
Okay, so our first big clue to cracking this paradox comes down to a really important distinction: seeing populism not as one thing, but as two. Populism as a protest movement versus populism as a ruling power.
Yeah, this is a huge mistake people make. You just can't treat populism as this one monolithic thing. You've got to separate these two forms. Because think about it, its role and its potential danger totally changes depending on whether it's on the outside protesting or on the inside, sitting in the driver's seat.
So let's break this down. On one hand, you have populism as a movement. Think of something like Occupy Wall Street. Here, it acts kind of like a democratic watchdog, right? It keeps an eye on the government. But when it becomes a ruling power, the whole game changes. The goal shifts from protest to, well, conquest. It's not about checking power anymore. It's about taking over the institutions themselves. And that's where it can become a real threat to democratic rules. So you might be asking, how do they justify this massive shift? Well, they use this really clever ideological trick. It's a Latin phrase, pars pro toto, which basically means taking a part and pretending it's the whole. They essentially argue that their supporters aren't just part of the people. No, they are the only authentic, real people. And everyone else? Well, they're just illegitimate. They don't count. And that idea that we are the only real people leads us straight into our next clue: a full-blown war over the very meaning of representation.
Nadia Urbanati, who wrote the source we're looking at, makes such a fascinating point about this. She calls populism parasitical. And that's a powerful word, right? The idea is that it doesn't want to kill representative democracy outright. Instead, it wants to live off of it, all while fighting to completely change the meaning of what representation is supposed to be. It's a really subtle but incredibly profound kind of attack.
What this really boils down to is two completely different ways of seeing the world. Constitutional democracy says, hey, representation is how we manage conflict between all sorts of different groups. But populism says no. Representation is about embodying one single, unified people. And in that populist view, elections suddenly aren't about holding leaders accountable. They just become simple yes or no votes, plebiscites basically, on a single leader who claims to be the one true voice of the nation.
Okay, this is where we get to a really interesting twist in the story, something we can call the majority trap. And to get our heads around this, we've actually got to go way back in time, all the way back to ancient Greece.
Just listen to this from Aristotle. We're talking more than 2,000 years ago, and he was already warning about demagogues who whip up the common people against the rich. It just goes to show you this core dynamic, a charismatic leader using social division to grab power, it's not new at all. It's an ancient political playbook.
And that's the thing. Just like with those ancient demagogues, modern populism absolutely thrives when a society is polarized. It gets a huge boost when the middle class is shrinking, usually because of an economic crisis. That kind of environment creates the perfect fertile ground for a leader to swoop in and promise to be the champion for the struggling masses against some so-called elite.
And this right here, this brings us to the absolute heart of the conflict. In a healthy democracy, majority rule is just a procedure, right? It's a tool for making decisions. The minority still has rights, and hey, they might win the next election and become the majority. But for populism, the rule of the majority is a form of domination. The minority isn't seen as a legitimate opponent anymore. They're seen as an enemy to be crushed.
So the goal isn't just about squeaking by with 51% of the vote. No, the goal is to build what you could call an intense majority, a political force that is so powerful, so overwhelming, that it makes any and all opposition feel completely and utterly meaningless.
So what happens next? Well, that brings us to the end game. Once that intense majority is in place, the very next step is to rewrite the rules of the entire system.
You see, a populist power is never happy just to win a game. It looks at the existing rules, the Constitution, the courts, all those checks and balances, and it sees them as obstacles.
The real goal, the ultimate objective, is to change the game itself so that their temporary power becomes permanent.
So what does this playbook actually look like in practice? Well, taking Hungary's fetus party as a case study, it goes something like this. Step 1, win a supermajority at the ballot box. Step 2, use that massive majority to just scrap or completely rewrite the Constitution. Step 3, bake your own party's ideology right into those new constitutional rules. And finally, step 4, systematically go after and weaken anyone who could possibly challenge you. We're talking opposition parties, independent judges, you name it.
And what you end up with is a system that's been called discriminatory legalism. It's perfectly summed up by that old, cynical saying, everything for my friends, for my enemies, the law. Suddenly, the law isn't a neutral referee anymore. It becomes a weapon, plain and simple, used by the state to reward its friends and punish its enemies.
So, what's the ultimate damage here? Well, this whole strategy completely erases the line between regular politics, like, say, passing a budget, and fundamental constitutional law. And by baking its own political program right into the Constitution, a populist power can effectively freeze what should be a temporary majority into a permanent one. It basically short-circuits the entire democratic process.
There's a really great metaphor to wrap this all up. Cross-eyed politics. Think about it. Both populism and democracy are looking at the exact same things, the people and the majority. But populism sees them in this totally distorted, cross-eyed way, a way that's just fundamentally at odds with how a constitutional democracy is supposed to work.
And all of this leaves us with a really critical question, one that gets to the very heart of what's at stake here. When the majority has all the power, what protects the minority? And maybe more importantly, can a system that fails to answer that question truly be called a democracy at all?